A young woman named Elena Marquez, just 23 years old, vanished into the shadows. She was last seen leaving her part-time job at a diner on Main Street, and then she was gone. No goodbyes. No trail. No trace. For the people of Ravenwood, it was unthinkable. Elena wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was the daughter of Luis and Marisol Marquez, hard-working immigrants who had built a life in Texas from nothing. She was the older sister to Isabella, a teenager who looked up to her like a second mother. Elena was bright, ambitious, and full of dreams. She wanted to be a nurse, to dedicate her life to helping others. And then, in a matter of hours, her life was stolen away. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Maybe her car had broken down on the rural highway. Maybe she had gone to a friend's house and lost track of time. But as the night dragged on, her parents' calls went unanswered. Her bed was still neatly made. Her purse was found on the floorboard of her old Toyota Corolla, the driver's side door left slightly open. A chill ran through Ravenwood. Something terrible had happened. The local police, led by Detective Raymond Cole, launched a frantic search. Officers combed fields, neighbors carried flashlights through dark back roads, and volunteers stapled Elena's smiling photo to telephone poles. For days, her face was everywhere, in shop windows, on TV screens, and in the broken voices of her parents begging for her safe return. But nothing came. No witnesses. No solid leads. The trail ended as suddenly as Elena had disappeared. By the end of the summer, the word no one wanted to say out loud began to echo in whispers. Murder. Still, there was no body, no suspect, no confession. Only silence. That silence became unbearable. For Elena's family, every phone call was a knife of hope that never cut clean. For the community, it was a wound that wouldn't heal. And for Detective Cole, it was a failure that haunted him, a case that slipped through his fingers despite every sleepless night, every desperate lead. The year 2002 was unforgiving for cases like this. Forensics were limited. DNA technology was still crawling compared to the tools detectives have today. Genetic genealogy, the science that would later solve thousands of cold cases, was just a dream. All they had were fingerprints, fibers, and the fading memories of witnesses who never saw enough. Without a body, the case crumbled. And just like that, the disappearance of Elena Marquez was shoved into a cold steel cabinet, where it gathered dust for nearly 2 decades. But the Marquez family never gave up. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, they lit candles outside St. Mary's Church. Her mother, Marisol, wore a small silver necklace with Elena's photo tucked inside. Her father grew older, his back bent, but he refused to stop asking questions. And her sister Isabella, who had once prayed for Elena's safe return, grew into adulthood with a single mission: to keep her memory alive. The community of Ravenwood moved on, at least on the surface. New stores opened, new families moved in, children grew up and left for bigger cities. But beneath it all, Elena's absence was a shadow that lingered. People remembered. People wondered. People feared. Then, after 20 years of silence, everything changed. In 2023, advances in forensic technology brought new eyes to Elena's cold case. Detective Sarah Klein, part of a special Texas cold case unit, reopened the file. This time there were new tools, new databases, and new hope. A small piece of evidence, once overlooked, now screamed with possibility. A DNA fragment, preserved all those years, was finally matched. The results pointed directly to one man, Caleb Rourke, a construction worker who had lived just miles from Elena's home in 2002. A man with a violent past hidden behind a smile. When the news broke that Caleb Rourke had been arrested for the murder of Elena Marquez, Ravenwood erupted in shock. For years, he had blended into the community, working jobs, attending church, even waving to the very family he had devastated. The arrest didn't just shock the Marquez family. It stunned neighbors, coworkers, and friends who thought they knew him. For the Marquez family, the moment was bittersweet. Justice was finally within reach, but it came at the cost of reopening a wound that had never fully closed. Elena's memory came rushing back, her laughter, her warmth, her dreams. But so did the grief of knowing she was never coming home. This is more than a crime story. This is the story of how a town carried a ghost for 20 years, how a family refused to let silence bury their daughter, and how science finally gave a voice to someone who could no longer speak. It's a story of loss, resilience, and the unrelenting pursuit of justice. And it all began in Texas, on a hot July night in 2002, when Elena Marquez vanished, and a community's nightmare began. July 12, 2002. It was a Friday night, one of those evenings when Ravenwood streets carried the hum of small-town life. Families crowded into Maggie's diner for burgers and milkshakes, kids roamed the sidewalks with ice cream cones, and the neon lights of the local movie theater buzzed softly against the summer air. Inside the diner, Elena Marquez wiped down the counter for the last time that shift, smiling faintly as she wished a couple good night. She had worked a double shift that day, nearly 12 hours on her feet, but despite her exhaustion she carried her usual warmth. It was almost 9:15 p.m. when she waved goodbye to her co-worker, Janet Hill, and walked out into the sticky Texas night. Elena climbed into her blue Toyota Corolla, an aging car her father had helped her keep running. Witnesses later recalled seeing her pull out of the diner's gravel lot and head toward the main road that led to her family's home just 15 minutes away. She should have been home before 9:45. But she never arrived. When 10 p.m. came and went, her parents, Luis and Marisol, grew uneasy. Elena was dependable to a fault. She always called if she was running late, always let them know when she was safe. At first, Luis tried to calm his wife. Maybe she had stopped for gas, maybe she had run into a friend, maybe traffic slowed her down. But by 10:30, when her phone rang unanswered, the unease hardened into fear. At 11:15, Luis got in his truck and began driving the route from their home to the diner. He scanned the shoulders of the road, the parking lots of convenience stores, even the ditches, praying he would spot her headlights or her familiar figure. What he found instead froze him. Just 2 miles from the diner, on a quiet stretch of County Road 18, Elena's Toyota sat abandoned on the shoulder. The driver's side door was cracked open, her purse lay on the floorboard, and the keys dangled loosely in the ignition. Luis's hands shook as he called Marisol, his voice breaking. "I found her car. But she's not here." Within the hour, the Ravenwood Police Department arrived. Detective Raymond Cole, who had just come off another shift, was called to the scene. Flashlights cut across the darkness, illuminating the eerie stillness of the vehicle. There were no signs of a struggle inside, but the grass along the roadside was bent, trampled as if someone had moved quickly through it. Cole crouched by the car, studying the scene, and felt a familiar chill, the kind that told him this was no simple disappearance. Something violent had happened here. By midnight, news spread like wildfire. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers joined the search. Dozens of people scoured fields and wooded areas with flashlights, calling Elena's name into the night. Dogs barked, police radios crackled, and helicopters thudded faintly above. The town of Ravenwood, usually so quiet, was now wide awake in a nightmare. Marisol clutched a rosary in her hands, praying aloud as tears streamed down her face. Isabella, just 17 at the time, begged officers for updates, her voice trembling with desperation. The Marquez family's worst fear was no longer abstract. It was real, standing in front of them with every unanswered call into the darkness. By dawn, the search expanded. Volunteers gathered at St. Mary's Church, where the pastor organized food and water for those combing through fields. Police teams dragged a nearby creek, sifted through underbrush, and canvassed the area door to door. Flyers with Elena's face, dark hair, warm smile, brown eyes, were rushed into print. Within hours, her picture was taped to storefronts, pinned to bulletin boards, and passed into countless hands. But despite the frantic search, the trail was already slipping away. No blood was found in the car. No obvious signs of a struggle inside. Her phone, an old flip model, had no GPS tracking capabilities. Every hour that passed felt like sand draining through an hourglass, each grain carrying hope away with it. Detective Cole pushed his small department to its limits. He interviewed co-workers at Maggie's diner, questioned customers who had been there that night, and tried to piece together Elena's final moments. Janet Hill confirmed that Elena had left alone, smiling, with no one following her out. A couple of patrons recalled seeing her car pull onto the main road, but after that, she vanished into the night. Then came the first flicker of suspicion. Several people, including one of the diner's busboys, mentioned that Caleb Rourke had been at the diner earlier that evening. Rourke, a construction worker with a reputation for drinking too much, had been seen watching Elena more than once in the past. Though no one could confirm he followed her that night, the mention was enough to put him on Detective Cole's radar. Still, suspicion wasn't evidence. With nothing concrete to hold on to, Rourke slipped away into the background like so many others. And as days turned into weeks, Elena's case shifted from an active search to a lingering ache. For the Marquez family, those first days were torture. Every ring of the phone jolted their hearts. Every knock on the door made them hold their breath. They prayed Elena would walk in, tired and embarrassed but alive. Instead, silence was all that came. The media swarmed Ravenwood, amplifying the story. Local stations ran Elena's photo nightly, and regional outlets picked it up, framing it as another young woman swallowed by mystery. Strangers mailed letters of support to the Marquez home, but some also whispered darker theories. Was it a lover's quarrel? Had Elena left willingly? The rumors cut deep, wounding the family even further. But for Detective Cole, the case was painfully clear. This was no runaway, no accident. Someone had taken Elena. And unless evidence surfaced soon, the trail would grow too cold to follow. By the end of August 2002, despite weeks of searching, despite countless interviews, the case hit a wall. The missing posters faded in the summer sun, the community's initial urgency softened, and Elena's name became less a headline and more a haunting question whispered in grocery store aisles. Her car, that silent witness left on the roadside, was impounded. Inside, her purse held nothing unusual, just her wallet, a tube of lipstick, and a half-used notebook filled with nursing program notes. The objects were heartbreakingly ordinary, a reflection of a young woman's life interrupted. Ravenwood returned to its routines, but the Marquez family never did. For them, time fractured that night. Every day forward was lived with an absence, a hollow where Elena should have been. And though no one realized it at the time, the disappearance of Elena Marquez had just entered its longest chapter, 20 years of silence. In the days immediately following Elena Marquez's disappearance, Ravenwood transformed from a sleepy Texas town into the center of a desperate investigation. For the first week, the case consumed everything: the airwaves, the newspapers, the church bulletins. Everyone wanted answers, but answers refused to come. Detective Raymond Cole took the lead. He was a veteran in the Ravenwood Police Department, a man who had seen his share of robberies, domestic disputes, and bar fights, but rarely something of this magnitude. The disappearance of a young woman in such a small, tightly knit community was unusual, and he knew the town's trust rested squarely on his shoulders. He assembled a task force of officers, patrol deputies, and volunteers, determined to leave no stone unturned. The first step was the scene of the car. Forensics officers combed through Elena's Toyota Corolla again and again. They dusted for fingerprints, swabbed for fibers, and photographed every inch of the vehicle. What they found was baffling. Her purse and belongings were still inside, suggesting she hadn't left willingly. The car keys dangled from the ignition, untouched. Yet there were no clear signs of a violent struggle. No blood, no broken glass, no torn clothing. It was as if she had been plucked from the earth in the span of seconds, leaving almost nothing behind. Detective Cole then turned to interviews. The staff and customers at Maggie's Diner were questioned repeatedly. Janet Hill, the co-worker who closed with Elena that night, insisted Elena had been her usual cheerful self when she left. A few patrons remembered her car pulling out of the lot, but none could say if anyone followed her. Then came the more unsettling testimony. Several people mentioned Caleb Rourke, the 28-year-old construction worker who had been in the diner earlier that evening. Rourke was known in Ravenwood for his drinking and occasional bar fights, but he was also a familiar face, the kind of man people waved at on the street even if they didn't know him well. More than one witness noted that he seemed to have paid particular attention to Elena over the months, watching her in ways that unsettled her friends. When questioned, Rourke admitted to being at the diner but denied any involvement in her disappearance. He claimed he went home after finishing his meal. Without physical evidence tying him to the scene, Cole couldn't hold him. Other suspects emerged briefly. A long-haul truck driver reported seeing a woman resembling Elena at a gas station 50 miles away, but surveillance footage revealed nothing useful. A registered sex offender living 3 towns over was investigated, but his alibi checked out. Every lead that surfaced seemed to crumble within days. Meanwhile, the Marquez family was thrust into the public eye. Luis and Marisol stood before cameras at press conferences, pleading for their daughter's safe return. "We just want Elena home," Marisol said through tears, clutching the silver locket with her daughter's photo. "If anyone knows anything, please come forward." Her words echoed on local news channels night after night, but the phone lines brought little more than false tips and dead ends. The media frenzy was relentless. Local reporters camped outside the Marquez home, and the case quickly spread beyond Ravenwood, appearing in state newspapers and even national coverage. For a brief moment, it seemed like the whole country was watching. Yet the increased attention only brought noise. Psychics called in claiming visions, opportunists offered theories, and anonymous tipsters sent investigators on wild goose chases. Cole and his team followed everything they could, but nothing broke the case open. Forensic science in 2002 offered little comfort. The DNA sample collected from Elena's car was too degraded to be useful at the time. The technology to process tiny trace samples simply wasn't available. The trampled grass near the roadside hinted at a struggle, but no shoe prints were clear enough to match. Cell phone records, still in their infancy, yielded almost nothing. Every piece of evidence slipped just out of reach. Inside the police station, frustration grew. Officers worked 14-hour days, their desks buried in reports, witness statements, and maps dotted with search grids. But as weeks turned into months, the energy began to wane. Leads dried up and the once buzzing tip line grew quiet. The case was moving toward the one thing no investigator wanted: stagnation. For the Marquez family, the silence was unbearable. Isabella, just 17, clung to hope, attending every vigil, writing letters to her sister, leaving them at the roadside where Elena's car had been found. Luis grew quieter, carrying his grief in silence, while Marisol's prayers became more desperate. The family home, once filled with warmth, became a place of shadows and unanswered questions. Detective Cole, though haunted, refused to let go. He pushed his officers to keep digging, revisiting Caleb Rourke more than once, combing through his background, questioning his co-workers. But Rourke kept his story straight, and without evidence, Cole's hands were tied. He was forced to release him every time, a decision that gnawed at him. In his gut, he felt Rourke knew more than he was saying, but gut feelings weren't enough for a warrant, let alone an arrest. By late 2002, the case slowed to a crawl. New crimes and responsibilities pulled at the small department's resources, and Elena's file, once front and center on Cole's desk, began to slip under the weight of newer cases. The vigils continued, but attendance dwindled. The media moved on. Ravenwood returned to routine, though never truly the same. Still, for those closest to Elena, the case was far from forgotten. For her family, every holiday was incomplete, every birthday a wound reopened. For Detective Cole, the case became personal, a ghost that followed him long after his shift ended. He often drove past the spot where her car was found, headlights sweeping the roadside grass, wondering what crucial detail he had missed. By the first anniversary of her disappearance, Elena's face still smiled from fading posters on bulletin boards, but the trail was cold. The investigation that had once gripped a community had lost its momentum, and the mystery of Elena Marquez seemed destined to remain unsolved. But time, as it would prove, was not an enemy. It was simply waiting for science to catch up. And though no one knew it then, the answer to the case had been hiding in plain sight all along, in evidence stored carefully in a box, waiting for the day technology would finally unlock its secrets. After the initial storm of searches, interviews, and media coverage, the case of Elena Marquez slowly slipped into the shadows. By early 2003, the town of Ravenwood no longer woke up to news cameras parked outside the police station. The missing person flyers, once stapled to every pole and pinned to every bulletin board, faded and peeled in the Texas sun. Life for most people went on. But for the Marquez family, life had ended the night Elena disappeared. What came afterward was only survival. For Luis and Marisol, every morning began with the same cruel reminder: their daughter's bed remained untouched. Marisol refused to pack away Elena's belongings. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her nursing textbooks still stacked neatly on the desk. She even left Elena's favorite mug, a chipped ceramic cup with painted sunflowers, on the kitchen counter, as if one day Elena would walk through the door, pour coffee, and laugh again. Denial wasn't a choice, it was a coping mechanism. To let go of those small details would mean admitting she was never coming home. Isabella, Elena's younger sister, struggled in her own way. At 17, she was thrust into the harsh reality of grief, adulthood, and responsibility all at once. While her classmates worried about prom dresses and college applications, Isabella carried the weight of her sister's absence. She left handwritten letters at the roadside memorial where Elena's car had been found. Some were filled with hope: "I know you'll come home and I'll be here waiting." Others were dark with despair: "Why did you leave me here alone?" Those letters, placed under stones or tucked into flowers, became her way of reaching for someone she could no longer touch. Detective Raymond Cole carried his own torment. Though officially the case was marked inactive by the end of 2003, Cole never considered it closed. The file stayed on his desk longer than it should have, long after the department urged him to prioritize newer cases. Nights found him hunched over old reports, reading and rereading every witness statement, every scrap of evidence, as if the truth might appear if he stared hard enough. More than once, he found himself parked along County Road 18, staring at the patch of earth where Elena's Toyota had been found, headlights washing over weeds that had long since grown back. "What am I missing?" he would whisper to the night. But the night never answered. The years wore people down. Friends of Elena, once loud in their support, eventually moved on with their own lives. Sofia Alvarez, her childhood best friend, married and relocated to Houston. She admitted years later that she carried guilt for leaving Ravenwood, as though distance meant betrayal. But grief is heavy and few people can carry it forever. The vigils, once attended by dozens, dwindled to a handful of faithful family members and close friends. Candles flickered against the dark, prayers were whispered, and Elena's name was spoken into the silence, but fewer and fewer outsiders came to listen. For the Marquez family, anniversaries became unbearable. On July 12th of every year, they gathered at St. Mary's Church, lighting candles in her memory. The pews grew emptier with each passing year, but Luis and Marisol never missed a single one. Isabella, who grew from a teenager into a woman in her 30s, carried the rituals forward. She promised her parents that Elena would never be forgotten, not by them, not by her. But promises were harder to keep as the town changed. New families moved in, unaware of the tragedy. Children grew up never hearing Elena's name. Ravenwood slowly buried its ghosts. The emotional toll was relentless. Luis, once a vibrant, hard-working mechanic, grew quiet and withdrawn. He aged rapidly, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. His hands, once steady with tools, trembled more often. He spent hours sitting on the porch, staring down the street, hoping for something, anything. Marisol, on the other hand, carried her grief like a flame. It burned her, but it also kept her moving. She attended every town meeting, pressed the police for updates, and wrote letters to state officials begging for renewed attention on cold cases. Her persistence was admirable, but it was also exhausting. Some in the community whispered that she should let it go, cruel words that only deepened her isolation. And through it all, Caleb Rourke remained free. He continued working construction, drinking at local bars, and blending into the fabric of Ravenwood. Every time Luis or Marisol saw him, even from a distance, rage coiled in their stomachs. They had no proof, no evidence, only suspicion. But sometimes suspicion is its own form of torture. To see the man they believed might have answers living his life while Elena's was stolen was a wound that never healed. The years stretched on, 2004, 2007, 2010. Each one brought advances in technology, new headlines about other cold cases solved elsewhere, other families finding closure. Every breakthrough in forensic science sparked a glimmer of hope, only to be dashed when Elena's case remained untouched. Boxes of evidence sat in storage, sealed and waiting, while the Marquez family lived in limbo. By 2012, a full decade after Elena vanished, Ravenwood marked the anniversary with little more than a short article in the local paper. 10 years gone, the disappearance of Elena Marquez, the headline read. For outsiders, it was history. For her family, it was a fresh wound reopened again and again. Isabella, now in her late 20s, took on the role of spokesperson. "We will not give up," she told the reporter. "We will not stop asking questions until my sister's story is finished." Her voice carried determination, but her eyes carried exhaustion. Detective Cole, now older and grayer, retired from the force in 2015. He left behind a career of service, but Elena's file was the one case that never left him. Even in retirement, he would occasionally call his former colleagues, asking if anything new had surfaced. "One day," he said quietly, "someone's going to crack it. Don't let it die with me." By 2020, nearly everyone believed the case was unsolvable. Luis's health declined, Marisol's hair turned silver, and Isabella carried the weight of keeping Elena's memory alive. The world had changed, smartphones, social media, genealogy databases, but Elena's case remained frozen in 2002, untouched by time except in the hearts of those who loved her. Yet fate has a strange way of working. The years of silence, though cruel, were not wasted. Evidence still waited in boxes. DNA still lingered on fibers, even if no one yet had the tools to see it clearly. Science marched forward, and with it, hope was slowly, silently reborn. The Marquez family didn't know it yet, but the answers they had prayed for through decades of silence were closer than they ever imagined. 2 decades had passed since Elena Marquez vanished from Ravenwood. Her memory lived on in her family's grief and in the dusty files stored deep in the evidence room, but for the world at large, her story was fading. By 2022, only a handful of people still spoke her name with urgency. Yet, in the quiet halls of the Texas Department of Public Safety's Cold Case Unit, Elena's file was about to breathe again. Entered Detective Sarah Klein. Unlike Detective Cole, who had carried the case in the early years, Klein belonged to a new era of law enforcement. She was sharp, relentless, and deeply invested in the potential of science to right old wrongs. With advances in DNA technology and forensic genealogy, Klein believed cases like Elena's could finally yield answers. When she opened the Marquez file, she didn't just see a cold case. She saw an opportunity, a puzzle waiting for tools that hadn't existed in 2002. The box of evidence was unremarkable on the outside: worn cardboard, yellowing labels, the smell of old paper and dust. But inside lay the fragments of Elena's last night. Her purse, her notebook, strands of hair from her car seat, a faint trace of skin cells recovered from the Toyota's door handle. Samples too small for testing back then, but preserved with meticulous care. Klein's heart raced as she realized the potential. "This isn't just a file," she told a colleague. "This is a voice waiting to be heard." In 2002, DNA required larger, cleaner samples to produce results. By 2022, the field had transformed. Laboratories could work with degraded fragments, amplifying them with precision unimaginable 20 years earlier. Klein sent the samples to a state-of-the-art lab specializing in forensic genealogy, the same kind of work that had brought down notorious criminals across the country. Weeks passed, filled with tense anticipation. Then the call came. The lab had a hit. The results pointed to a genetic profile, one that linked directly to a family tree in Texas. Through painstaking genealogical mapping, analysts traced the DNA to a single man, Caleb Rourke. The name was familiar. His file was already in the original investigation notes, flagged as person of interest. He had been interviewed in 2002, denied involvement, and walked free. But now, science was telling a different story. Detective Klein felt the weight of the discovery. It wasn't just about catching a suspect. It was about finally giving the Marquez family the truth they had begged for. Still, she knew DNA was powerful but not always enough. She needed corroboration. So she dug deeper into Rourke's past. Caleb Rourke had lived on the outskirts of Ravenwood in 2002, less than 3 miles from where Elena's car was found. His work history showed late-night construction shifts, often driving past County Road 18. Old bar records placed him drinking heavily the night of Elena's disappearance. Even more chilling, Klein uncovered a record of prior assault charges, dismissed due to lack of evidence, against women who described his behavior as predatory. The pattern was undeniable. But what sealed the case was a fresh interview. In late 2022, Klein and her team approached Rourke under the guise of a routine traffic stop. They collected a discarded soda can from his truck, swabbed it, and sent it for testing. The results confirmed it beyond doubt. The DNA from Elena's car matched Rourke's genetic profile. Science had caught up with what instinct had whispered 20 years earlier. When Klein presented the findings to her unit, the room went silent. 2 decades of silence, 2 decades of pain, and finally, the breakthrough. "It's him," she said firmly. "We've got him." The next step was careful planning. Rourke had lived undisturbed in Ravenwood for 20 years. He blended in, attended local events, and presented himself as a man with nothing to hide. But beneath the facade, he had been carrying a secret. When investigators obtained a warrant for his arrest in early 2023, the operation was kept under tight wraps. They didn't want him to slip away. The arrest itself was swift but dramatic. On a gray February morning, as Rourke left his house to head to a construction job, unmarked vehicles swarmed his truck. Officers pulled him out, cuffed him, and read him his rights. Neighbors watched from their porches, mouths open, as the man they thought they knew was taken away. For many, it was a moment of disbelief. For the Marquez family, it was a moment of vindication. When the news broke, it hit Ravenwood like a thunderclap. "Arrest made in 2002, cold case of Elena Marquez," the headline screamed. The community, once resigned to silence, was suddenly shaken awake. People who hadn't spoken of Elena in years found themselves recalling her smile, her kindness, her laughter. Old wounds reopened, but this time there was the promise of closure. For Marisol, the moment was overwhelming. She clutched Elena's silver necklace and whispered through tears, "Mija, we did it. We didn't stop." Luis, frail and aged, wept openly, his grief colliding with relief. Isabella, now a grown woman, stood at their side, her voice steady but trembling. "We told them you mattered. And now the world knows." Detective Cole, long retired, received a call from Klein. His voice cracked as he said, "I knew it. I knew it all those years." Though age had pulled him from the front lines, the case that had haunted him for decades finally found resolution in his lifetime. For him, too, it was justice. But justice wasn't just about the arrest. It was about what came next. The charges, the courtroom, the confrontation between truth and denial. The arrest was not the end of the story. It was the spark that reignited everything. After 20 years of silence, the case of Elena Marquez was alive again. And for the first time, the Marquez family could begin to imagine answers to the questions that had haunted them for 2 decades. What happened that night? Why her? And how could a man live free for 20 years while her family suffered? The answers were coming. The silence had finally been broken. When the name Caleb Rourke appeared in the official arrest reports, the town of Ravenwood froze in disbelief. For many, he wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was someone they knew, a neighbor, a coworker, a man who waved as he passed on the street. To discover that Caleb had been arrested for the murder of Elena Marquez was not only shocking, it was terrifying. It forced everyone to ask the same chilling question. How could a man live among us hiding something so monstrous for 20 years? Caleb James Rourke was born in 1974, raised on the rougher side of Ravenwood. His childhood was marked by instability, a father who drifted from job to job, a mother who struggled with addiction, and a home filled more with silence than love. By his teenage years, Caleb was already known to local law enforcement for petty crimes, shoplifting, vandalism, and fights that left more than one classmate bloodied. Teachers described him as intelligent but volatile, a boy who could flash a charming smile one moment and explode in rage the next. As he grew older, Caleb followed in his father's footsteps, taking on construction work that paid just enough to scrape by. He was strong, broad-shouldered, and unafraid of long hours in the Texas heat. On the surface, he was just another working man, rough around the edges but seemingly harmless. Beneath that exterior, however, lay a pattern of behavior that would later look disturbingly clear. Former girlfriends described Caleb as controlling, quick to anger, and at times physically intimidating. One who spoke anonymously after his arrest said, "He could be sweet, but it was like flipping a switch. One wrong word, one wrong look, and he'd turn into someone else entirely." Several women had filed complaints of harassment or assault against him in the late 1990s and early 2000s, but without hard evidence, charges never stuck. He slipped through the cracks of the system, leaving behind whispers but no convictions. Caleb also had a habit that unsettled many. He watched. People at Maggie's Diner remembered him sitting alone in a corner booth, nursing a coffee long after it had gone cold, his eyes fixed on the waitresses. And though he spoke little, the way he stared made several women uncomfortable. Elena Marquez in particular had noticed his gaze. She confided to her friend Sofia Alvarez weeks before her disappearance that Caleb gave her a bad feeling. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a passing concern. In hindsight, it was a warning ignored. When Detective Sarah Klein's team reopened the case and traced the DNA back to Caleb, those old stories resurfaced with disturbing clarity. His history of aggression, his presence at the diner the night Elena disappeared, his proximity to where her car was found, everything pointed to him. Yet, for 20 years he had managed to live undetected, blending into the very fabric of Ravenwood life. Neighbors described him as quiet, solitary, and just another face. He attended church sporadically, showed up at barbecues, and offered to help fix fences or carry heavy loads. On the surface, nothing about him screamed danger. That was perhaps the most chilling part. Caleb Rourke had perfected the art of invisibility. He wasn't the stranger in a dark alley. He was the man holding the door open at the grocery store. But as investigators peeled back the layers of his life, a darker picture emerged. Caleb never left Ravenwood, despite opportunities to move for work. He stayed tethered to the place where Elena's memory lingered, almost as if daring fate to catch him. Police records revealed several arrests for bar fights over the years, but the charges were always minor and dismissed quickly. Behind closed doors, his relationships were unstable, filled with anger and intimidation. A pattern of control, obsession, and violence ran through his life like a shadow. The community's reaction to his arrest was explosive. Some neighbors refused to believe it. "Caleb? No way," one man told reporters. "He helped me rebuild my porch last year. He's not capable of something like that." Others admitted that, in retrospect, they always felt something off about him. "He had this stare," a woman said, "like he was looking straight through you. Gives me chills now thinking about it." For the Marquez family, hearing Caleb's name was like reopening an old wound with fresh salt. Marisol remembered seeing him in the diner in 2002, smiling faintly as Elena served him coffee. Luis recalled crossing paths with him at the hardware store, never imagining the man in front of him might know the truth about his daughter's disappearance. Isabella, now an adult, shuddered as she realized Caleb had lived freely in the same town where her family mourned, carrying their pain while he carried his secret. When Caleb was questioned after his arrest, his demeanor was unsettling. He didn't weep or rage. He didn't plead innocence with passion. Instead, he smirked, shrugged, and said little. Detectives described him as eerily calm, as though 20 years of hiding had hardened him into stone. But silence was no longer his ally. DNA evidence spoke louder than denial, and the walls were closing in. The psychological portrait of Caleb Rourke began to crystallize. A man who wore normalcy like a mask, who moved through life unnoticed, and who harbored a darkness that only revealed itself in moments of violence. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of the predator next door, the kind of man communities fear most because he doesn't look like a monster until it's too late. As the news spread, Ravenwood found itself divided. Some felt betrayed, realizing they had shared pews, sidewalks, and workplaces with a killer. Others turned their guilt inward, wondering if they had ignored warning signs, if they had failed Elena by not seeing what was in front of them. Fear rippled through the town. If Caleb could hide among them for 20 years, what else, or who else, might be hiding in plain sight? For the investigators, however, the focus was clear. They had their suspect. They had their evidence. And now they had the responsibility to build a case that would stand in court, a case strong enough to carry the weight of 2 decades of grief. Caleb's arrest was only the beginning. The true fight for justice was just beginning to unfold. It was a gray February morning in 2023 when Ravenwood finally saw the moment it had waited for over 2 decades. The chill in the air carried a weight heavier than winter. Detective Sarah Klein, flanked by officers from the Cold Case Unit and the County Sheriff's Department, finalized the plan that had been weeks in the making. The warrant had been signed. The surveillance was complete. Today, Caleb Rourke would face the consequences of what he had hidden for 20 years. Caleb's modest house sat on the outskirts of town, a sagging single story with peeling paint and a yard cluttered with rusting tools. To most, it looked like nothing more than a working man's dwelling. But to the team assembled in unmarked cars nearby, it was a crime scene waiting to erupt into justice. Officers checked their radios, their weapons, their positioning. They wanted the arrest to be swift, controlled, undeniable. At 6:45 a.m., the front door creaked open. Caleb stepped out, coffee thermos in hand, work boots thudding against the porch steps. He wore the same construction jacket he had been seen in countless times, ordinary, unremarkable. He moved toward his truck, unaware that the eyes of law enforcement were locked on him, every step marking the end of his freedom. "Move," Detective Klein's voice came over the radio. In seconds, 3 unmarked vehicles roared into the driveway, blocking Caleb's truck from the front and sides. Doors flew open. Officers surged forward, weapons drawn but steady. "Caleb Rourke," one shouted. "Hands in the air. Now." For a moment, Caleb froze, his expression caught between confusion and defiance. Then he raised his hands, slow and deliberate, the thermos slipping from his grip and splattering coffee onto the frozen ground. Officers rushed him, pressing him against the truck, cold steel cuffs clamping around his wrists. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He only smirked faintly, as though the weight of 2 decades couldn't break his practiced facade. Neighbors, jolted by the sudden commotion, spilled onto porches in their robes and slippers. Shock rippled through the street. Gasps, whispers, and muttered disbelief filled the air. To them, Caleb was the man who waved at their kids, who fixed fences, who shared beers at backyard barbecues. To see him pinned against a truck, shackled and surrounded by police, was like watching a mask ripped away from someone they never truly knew. Word spread with wildfire speed. Within hours, local news crews were parked on the street, cameras capturing the once familiar figure of Caleb Rourke being led into a patrol car. "Arrest made in 2002, cold case of Ravenwood woman," headlines blared. 20 years of silence had just shattered in a single morning. At the Marquez household, the phone rang before the sun had fully risen. Marisol answered, her voice groggy, her heart pounding as she recognized Detective Klein's tone. "We have him," Klein said simply. Marisol's knees buckled. The receiver slipped slightly in her hand as tears welled in her eyes. "After all these years?" she whispered. "Yes," Klein confirmed. "It's him. It's over." For Luis, frail and aged, the news was overwhelming. He sat in his worn armchair, his hands trembling as Marisol relayed the words. His eyes filled with tears, his voice cracking for the first time in years. "Mija," he whispered to the empty room, "they found him. Justice is coming." Isabella, now 37, pressed a hand to her mouth as the reality sank in. For most of her adult life, she had lived with the shadow of her sister's disappearance. To know the man responsible had been caught was both a relief and a torment. Relief because the endless waiting had ended. Torment because the arrest brought the horror back in sharp, vivid detail. Still, through the tears, she managed to say, "We never stopped fighting for you, Elena. Never." Meanwhile, back in town, reactions were divided. Some residents admitted they always felt something off about Caleb. "He had a temper," one said. "He scared people when he drank." Others were stunned. "No way," a coworker insisted to reporters. "He was quiet, kept to himself." "You're telling me he was capable of this?" Unbelievable. The arrest forced Ravenwood to confront a chilling truth. For 2 decades they had lived side by side with a predator, never realizing it. At the sheriff's department, Caleb was processed, fingerprinted, and booked. The official charge sheet listed kidnapping and murder, linked directly to the disappearance of Elena Marquez. For the first time, Elena's name appeared in the same breath as accountability. It was a moment of vindication not just for her family but for every cold case family still waiting, still hoping. Reporters crowded outside the courthouse the next day, cameras flashing as Caleb was escorted in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles. He kept his eyes forward, expression unreadable as journalists shouted questions. "Did you kill Elena Marquez? Why did you do it? Do you have anything to say to her family?" He gave no answer. His silence was louder than any denial. Inside the courtroom, the Marquez family sat together in the front row. Marisol clutched her silver locket, tears streaking her face. Luis leaned heavily on a cane, his eyes fixed on Caleb with a quiet fury that had been building for 2 decades. Isabella sat between them, her jaw clenched, her body trembling with both rage and relief. For the first time, they looked into the eyes of the man accused of stealing Elena's life. And for the first time he couldn't look away. Detective Klein, seated behind the prosecution, watched Caleb with cold determination. This was the moment she had fought for, the culmination of years of scientific advancement and relentless persistence. But she knew this was only the beginning. An arrest was not the same as a conviction. The fight for justice had entered its next stage. For Ravenwood, the arrest was both closure and rupture. Closure because the name that haunted the town was finally linked to accountability. Rupture because the illusion of safety had been shattered. Parents pulled their children closer. Neighbors questioned their own instincts. If Caleb had lived freely among them for 20 years, what else had they failed to see? As Caleb was led back to his cell, the weight of the moment hung heavy over everyone present. For the Marquez family, it was the closest thing to justice they had felt in 20 years. But justice, they knew, wasn't complete until the truth was spoken in full, until Caleb answered for every second of silence he had forced upon them. And so, as the bars clanged shut behind him, Ravenwood braced for what came next. The trial, the evidence, and the long-awaited reckoning. The arrest was the breaking point. The trial would be the storm. The courthouse in Travis County, Texas was packed on the morning of Caleb Rourke's arraignment. Reporters lined the steps outside, their cameras flashing as attorneys, detectives, and family members walked in. For the people of Ravenwood, this was no longer just a case, it was history. The trial of the man accused of murdering Elena Marquez was about to begin, and the whole community braced itself for the truth they had been denied for over 20 years. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. Judge Miriam Holloway, known for her sharp wit and no-nonsense demeanor, presided from the bench. On the prosecution side sat District Attorney Paul Hensley, a seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for methodical precision. Behind him, Detective Sarah Klein and her team prepared the mountain of evidence that had resurrected the case. Across the aisle sat Caleb Rourke and his defense attorney, Richard Calloway, a smooth-talking lawyer brought in from Houston, determined to poke holes in 2 decades of silence. The charges were read aloud: kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder in the first degree. Caleb sat expressionless, his hands folded, his face calm. To the Marquez family seated in the front row, that calm was infuriating. They wanted rage, remorse, anything human. Instead, they were met with the same unsettling mask he had worn for years. The prosecution began with what they called the backbone of the case, DNA. In clear, deliberate language, D.A. Hensley explained to the jury how the skin cells found on Elena's car door handle in 2002 were too degraded for analysis back then, but had been preserved. He outlined how advancements in forensic genealogy in 2022 allowed the cold case unit to trace the DNA to Caleb's family line, narrowing it down to him through a combination of public databases and investigative work. To drive it home, he presented the confirmation test, the discarded soda can taken from Caleb's truck, which matched the DNA from the car. This, Hensley declared, holding up the lab report, is the fingerprint of truth. It waited 20 years, but it never faded. The defense countered swiftly. Calloway argued that DNA alone was not enough. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began smoothly, we are talking about a few microscopic cells found on a car door. DNA can be transferred through the simplest of means. A handshake, a brush of clothing, a moment in passing. It does not prove murder. It does not prove intent. It does not prove guilt. He leaned on the lack of a body, the absence of direct eyewitnesses, and the passage of time to sow doubt. This case is built on ghosts and guesses, he declared. But the prosecution had more than DNA. They painted a chilling portrait of Caleb's behavior leading up to Elena's disappearance. Witnesses from Maggie's diner testified to his lingering stares, his habit of watching Elena. Former girlfriends took the stand, recounting his violent temper, his controlling tendencies, and incidents of physical intimidation. One woman's voice trembled as she said, "He knew how to hide his anger in public, but behind closed doors, it was terrifying." The judge allowed the testimony as evidence of Caleb's pattern of behavior, strengthening the prosecution's narrative. The most emotional moments came from the Marquez family themselves. Marisol, now older, her hair silver, walked slowly to the stand. She held Elena's necklace in her hand as she spoke. Her voice cracked but did not break as she described the night her daughter disappeared, the decades of silence that followed, and the unbearable pain of not knowing. "For 20 years, she said, tears streaming, we lit candles and prayed. We begged for answers. And every day I looked at her empty bed and wondered what her last moments were like. We lost her once in 2002. We lost her every day after that." Isabella, now hardened by years of grief, followed her mother. She looked directly at Caleb as she spoke, her tone sharper, angrier. "You stole her from us. You lived your life while we buried ours in grief. I want this jury to know, my sister mattered. She was more than a name on a file. She was my best friend, my protector, my family." Her words struck the courtroom like a hammer. Even some jurors wiped their eyes. The defense tried to undercut the emotional testimony by reminding the jury of the burden of proof. Calloway argued that while the family's pain was real, it did not prove Caleb's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. He highlighted inconsistencies in witness memories, the lack of physical evidence tying Caleb directly to a crime scene, and the fact that no body had ever been recovered. "We cannot convict a man on emotion alone," he repeated like a mantra. But the prosecution anticipated this. D.A. Hensley closed with a powerful argument. For 20 years, Elena Marquez was silenced. But science gave her back her voice. Caleb Rourke thought time would protect him. He thought silence would shield him. But the truth has a way of waiting. And now 20 years later it's here. Do not let him hide behind the very silence he created. Throughout the trial, Caleb remained calm, occasionally whispering to his attorney, never showing remorse or anger. That calm unsettled the jury who watched him closely. Some later admitted that his lack of emotion made it harder to see him as innocent. He looked less like a wronged man and more like someone indifferent to the life he was accused of taking. The trial stretched for weeks, but the momentum built steadily against Caleb. The DNA evidence, the witness testimonies, the patterns of violence, together they formed a net too tight to slip through. And while the defense argued passionately, the weight of 2 decades of truth was too heavy to ignore. When closing arguments concluded, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. The jury filed out, carrying not just the case but the burden of a community's grief. Hours turned into a day. Then, on the afternoon of the second day, the jury returned. The verdict would decide whether the Marquez family's fight for justice would finally be complete. As the foreman stood, every breath in the courtroom held. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Caleb James Rourke." The words that followed would shake Ravenwood forever. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict. Every eye in the room locked onto him, every breath caught in the air. For the Marquez family, 21 years of waiting, grieving, and demanding answers came down to this moment. Judge Miriam Holloway nodded for the foreman to proceed. His voice was steady, but to the family it thundered like a drumbeat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Caleb James Rourke, guilty of the charge of first-degree murder." The words echoed across the courtroom. Gasps erupted from the gallery, reporters scrambled to jot notes, and the sound of Marisol's sobbing filled the front row. She collapsed into Luis's arms, clutching her locket, whispering through tears, "Gracias Dios, justice for Elena." Luis, his face lined with decades of sorrow, closed his eyes as tears streamed down. He gripped his wife's hand tightly, as if holding on to her kept him from breaking apart entirely. Isabella sat rigid, tears glistening in her eyes, but her expression was steely. She turned her gaze toward Caleb. For the first time in years, she didn't see the mask of calm that had unsettled her. Instead, she saw defeat. His shoulders slumped slightly as the reality of his conviction sank in. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "You can't hide anymore. She matters. She always mattered." Caleb was led out of the courtroom in shackles, still expressionless, though a flicker of bitterness crossed his face. He had hidden for 20 years, but silence had failed him. The system he had evaded for decades had finally caught up. His presence, once a shadow over Ravenwood, was gone. But his absence now revealed the depth of scars he had left behind. The courtroom buzzed with emotion. Some spectators wept openly, remembering Elena's disappearance as though it had been yesterday. Others shook their heads in disbelief. "All these years," one whispered, "and he was right here living among us." The conviction was not just a legal decision. It was a reckoning for a community that had unknowingly harbored a killer for 2 decades. Outside, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, cameras, and townspeople who had come to witness the conclusion of the case that had haunted Ravenwood since 2002. Flashbulbs exploded as District Attorney Paul Hensley addressed the press. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," he said firmly. "Today, the Marquez family finally received the verdict they have waited for. This case is a reminder that science, persistence, and faith can outlast even the longest silence." Detective Sarah Klein, standing beside him, added, "Elena Marquez's voice was stolen in 2002. But through evidence, through truth, she has spoken again. This verdict belongs to her and to the family who never stopped fighting." Her words struck deeply, reminding everyone that while justice had been served, it had come at an unbearable cost. Back at the Marquez home, candles once again lit the front porch, this time not for a vigil but for a vigil of gratitude. Family, friends, and neighbors gathered, some bringing flowers, others carrying photographs of Elena. The atmosphere was both somber and healing. For the first time, the candles symbolized not only loss but also closure. Marisol stood on the porch, her voice trembling as she addressed those gathered. "For 21 years we prayed for this day. We prayed that Elena would not be forgotten. Today we finally have justice. It does not bring her back, but it tells the world that her life mattered, that her voice mattered. And for that we are grateful." Luis, though frail, spoke as well. His voice was hoarse but steady. "I can finally sleep knowing that the man who took her from us will never walk free again. For years I stared at an empty chair at our table. Tonight I will still see it, but I will also see justice seated there too." His words brought tears to the crowd, many of whom had known Elena as a child, a friend, a neighbor. For Isabella, the verdict brought a complicated relief. She had grown up in the shadow of her sister's absence, her teenage years stolen by grief, her adulthood shaped by loss. Now at 37 she felt both free and burdened. Free because the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Burdened because the years could not be returned. "I'm glad he's gone," she told a reporter quietly. "But justice doesn't erase birthdays, graduations, or all the times we needed her and she wasn't there. Justice doesn't bring her home. It just stops him from taking anything else." The community of Ravenwood faced its own reckoning. For years they had whispered theories, speculated on rumors, and let time dull their urgency. Now, with Caleb exposed, many felt guilty for not seeing what had been in plain sight. "He lived among us," one neighbor admitted. "We drank with him, worked with him, laughed with him. And all the while Elena's family suffered. We should have seen it. We should have pushed harder." The trial forced Ravenwood to confront the fragility of trust, and the haunting truth that evil can hide in ordinary places. Still, there was healing. Churches held memorial services, dedicating sermons to Elena's life and the persistence of her family. Schools spoke about her in assemblies, reminding students of the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong. The case became a reminder not just of tragedy, but of resilience, proof that even in darkness, persistence could carve a path to light. The Marquez family, though still grieving, began to reclaim pieces of their lives. Marisol continued to wear Elena's locket, but now with a different weight, less desperation, more remembrance. Luis, though older and weaker, found strength in the knowledge that he had lived long enough to see the truth revealed. Isabella, standing as the bridge between past and future, vowed to carry her sister's legacy forward. She began organizing community events in Elena's name, raising awareness for missing persons and cold cases, determined that her sister's story would not fade again. In the end, the verdict was more than a legal victory. It was a testament to the strength of a family who refused to let silence bury the truth. It was a reminder to Ravenwood that evil can hide in plain sight but cannot remain hidden forever. And it was a tribute to Elena Marquez, a young woman whose life was stolen, but whose memory demanded justice until justice was done. The case of Elena Marquez had spanned more than 2 decades, from that humid night in July 2002 when she vanished on her way home, to the gray February morning in 2023 when her killer was finally arrested, to the moment in court when a jury spoke the words her family had waited half a lifetime to hear: guilty. For the Marquez family, the verdict brought a bittersweet kind of peace. It did not erase the pain. It did not return Elena to the home where her bed still sat untouched, or bring back the sound of her laughter at the dinner table. It did not give Isabella her sister back, or allow Luis and Marisol to see their eldest daughter fulfill her dream of becoming a nurse. But it gave them something else, something vital. It gave them truth. It gave them recognition. It gave them justice. In the weeks after the trial, the Marquez family returned to the rhythms of life, though nothing about life felt normal. Each of them carried Elena differently. Marisol, who had worn her daughter's photo in a silver locket for over 20 years, finally allowed herself to take it off at night. She told friends, "I can rest now." She can rest now. Luis, though frail, seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For Isabella, the youngest, the journey had shaped her entire adulthood. She had become not just Elena's sister but her voice, her advocate, her protector in memory. Now, with the trial over, she turned her grief into action, launching a community initiative to raise awareness for unsolved cases across Texas. "If we can keep even one family from waiting 20 years, she said, then my sister's story will keep saving lives." For Ravenwood, the trial left a lasting scar. The town had lived for years with Caleb Rourke in its midst, eating in its diners, drinking in its bars, fixing its fences. The revelation that a murderer had walked freely among them forced a painful reckoning. Neighbors who once greeted him with casual waves now admitted they felt a chill looking back. "He was right there all along," one resident whispered. "We just never saw him for what he was." But Ravenwood also found strength in the case. Vigils turned into memorials of solidarity. Churches spoke of Elena's legacy, reminding congregations that justice delayed does not mean justice denied. Schools used her story as a lesson in vigilance, compassion, and resilience. In a way, Elena's absence became a presence. Her name carried not just as a reminder of tragedy, but as a call to protect and honor the vulnerable. Detective Sarah Klein, whose persistence had brought the case back to life, continued to work cold cases with renewed fire. In interviews, she often spoke of Elena as more than a file. "She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. I never met her, but through her story I felt like I knew her. That's what kept me going. That's why we fight for cold cases. Because behind every folder is a human life that mattered." Her words inspired departments across the state to reopen forgotten files, proving that science and determination could breathe life into long-buried truths. As for Detective Raymond Cole, the retired officer who had carried the case in its earliest days, the conviction was both vindication and heartbreak. "I always knew he was the one," Cole admitted quietly. "But knowing and proving are two different things. I wish we could have given the Marquez family answers sooner. 20 years is too long." Yet, when he stood at Elena's graveside during a memorial service after the trial, he whispered to her photo, "We didn't forget you. We never will." The broader lesson of Elena's case rippled far beyond Ravenwood. It became a symbol of how time, though cruel, can also be an ally when combined with persistence. Forensic science had caught up to what human instinct always suspected. DNA, once too weak to be read, had spoken louder than any witness ever could. Her case reminded the world that justice is not bound by years. It waits, it lingers, and when pursued with relentless dedication, it can outlast silence. Elena's story was also a testament to the power of family. Luis, Marisol, and Isabella never gave up. They lit candles year after year even when no one else showed up. They kept her memory alive when the town grew quiet, when reporters left, when detectives turned to other cases. It was their love, fierce, unrelenting, that kept Elena's name alive long enough for science to finally bring the truth. Without their persistence, her file might still be gathering dust in a forgotten cabinet. And so, in the end, Elena Marquez's legacy was not one of tragedy alone. It was a legacy of persistence, of community reckoning, of science catching up with justice. It was a story of how a young woman who once dreamed of becoming a nurse, of healing others, continued to touch lives even in death. Her story healed her family's wound by finally answering their questions. It healed her town by forcing it to face uncomfortable truths. And it continues to heal others by inspiring the fight for cold cases still waiting in silence. On the 20th anniversary of her disappearance, before the verdict was even delivered, Isabella had lit a candle at the roadside where Elena's car was found. After the trial, she returned there once more, this time with her parents. Together, they placed fresh flowers and stood in silence as the candle burned. The roadside grass, long since grown back, swayed gently in the Texas breeze. Marisol whispered, "We kept our promise, Mija. We never stopped. Now you can rest." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting Ravenwood in hues of gold and crimson, the family held hands. For the first time in 21 years, the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of despair, but the silence of peace. Elena Marquez's voice had been stolen in 2002. But through truth, persistence, and love, her voice had spoken again, and it would echo forever.